very important context to trying to ground this a little bit for everybody in a bit of a picture. And the picture that we're going to present, please note that it says draft for discussion at the top of it. We're trying to, this whole question of, we presume the rights, the title are there. You have the power to be, First Nations have the power to be self-determining, to form self-government, but the question is, how do you get there? Where are you starting from, and where do you want to get to? So we thought we would try and create, a rudimentary picture that would put us all together on the same page. And I'm going to go through it really, really quickly because we're going to return to these discussions again and again over the next 2.5 days, dive into some of it in detail, and have lots of debate and discussion about them. So my part is really just to quickly introduce you. As Satsan said, and Francis will talk a little bit more about the project itself, by working with communities who are forging their own path towards self-determination, and by learning from those who have already started the journey, we want to create not just models, but actually perhaps a roadmap or roadmaps to help people get there. Hopefully, by working with you all and with others, we might even find some better and faster routes to get there. As we all know, it's for those who have started the journey, it has taken a long time. So as with any journey, you need to kind of figure out roughly where you're starting from and where you want to get to before you can start planning the way. And so this document is, I guess the way to start imagining it is, I've given you a map of the North Pole and the South Pole. And that's it. The Indian Act being one of those poles, and self-determination on the other being the other pole. And as with any journey, there's a million different possible routes that you can take from there to there. So there's, recognize there's lots of white space in the middle, probably lots of different arrows, and it really is up to you to plan the route ahead yourself. Other than saying this is very draft, I do want to acknowledge that, putting it together, we brought on some really great thinking. Some of the folks who are here in the room today and will be with us for the next couple of days. Stephen Cornell and the work that he's done with American Indian Nations in the U.S. Kent McNeil and his thinking about the full box of rights and title. Francis and Michael Prince, who's here, have done some great work on economy. And of course, the Center for First Nations Governance and their 5 pillars of effective governance. And it was just all too much to kind of get onto one page, but I would like to acknowledge their work there. So we don't pretend to have this quite right yet, and we invite you to look at it in detail and give us feedback now or in the weeks ahead to help us make us better. So the way to read this is really sort of from left to right, where you've got the Indian Act as one pole, as I said, self-determination another, and then below that, the essential building blocks that we've identified so far that are necessary for you to consider as you start planning your route. You don't have to start from top to bottom. You can really begin anywhere on this map. Some First Nations will want to focus on lawmaking. Others may want to start with administrative capacity. Others have already started with investments in economic development and becoming economic self-reliant. So there's no particular hierarchy in any of the particular building blocks that we've talked to, except to say that the job of self-determination, true self-government, is not done until you've more or less found a balance between all of those fundamental elements. So very quickly, just want to point out some of the key differences that are mentioned in this document. Now, what's the difference between trying to govern under the Indian Act and being self-governing? So first and most important is really the legal basis and effect of governing authority. So as you already are well aware, under the Indian Act, the ultimate decision-making authority is with the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, and the chief and council system, a structure that's dictated by the Indian Act, have their primary legal accountability for their decisions and actions to the minister, not to their own people. Under self-government, the inherent right is vested in the people and your citizens who decide as a collectivity how they will make decisions for themselves, their land, and resources. Whoop. Ah, it wasn't supposed to go off. What did I do? Ah, great. So then under self-government, the structures of government are decided again by the citizens of the nation as a whole, usually through constitutional documents or other discussions like that, and the linkages between the structures of government that they want, with accountability for decisions within those structures flowing from the leadership back to the people. It's the people and leadership equation. The Indian Act, on the other hand, dictates that the only legitimate governing mechanism is the community-based chief and council system, with the minister having paramount authority. And other related First Nations organizations, such as economic arms, housing, education, or health services, are by and large have to be created under federal or provincial laws of incorporation or the Societies Act, which I think is an interesting discussion point, because that can sometimes create real issues of accountability between these organizations and the band councils over time. So when we're looking at kind of that how-to story move from one to the other, I think that'll be an interesting point of discussion. Then we have the issue of citizenship, of a nation versus band membership. So the Minister of Indigenous Affairs under the Act determines who is a member of a band, but self-determining First Nations, of course, establish their own citizenship criteria. And we have John Bizot from the Tlicho government here, and you might want to ask him a bit about how the Tlicho made decisions about how they would identify citizens. In regards to, come on, lawmaking, self-determining First Nations create and enforce their own laws over a range of matters on their territories, including establishing the appropriate appeal mechanisms or courts related to those laws. And none of this exists under the Indian Act, of course. Chiefs and councils have very limited lawmaking authority, and the Minister of Indigenous Affairs is supposed to resolve community disputes. The next one in regards to land and resources, this is a slightly more complicated picture to draw, and we were even debating some of it last night. You know, it really depends on the region of the country, whether or not there are undisputed treaties in existence in respect of land ownership and control. And then certainly under the Indian Act, reserve lands are considered Crown lands, and so the scope of authority is constrained by the Crown. Where a modern land agreement exists, title to the land and resources and the specific related authorities are usually spelled out in that agreement. And then, of course, in regards to traditional territories, Canadian law increasingly now recognizes Indigenous title and the requirement of federal and provincial governments to consult and reach accommodation with Indigenous title holders on any issues related to land and resources. But that, as I say, that picture is particularly complex, and so certainly would appreciate any suggestions about how to try and keep a simple picture but make it more complete. Under capacity, here we're referring to the organizations, the people, and the funding available for administering government and delivering programs and services to the people. The key difference in this area really is who gets to decide program and funding priorities and investments, and what investments will be made in administering and delivering government. So under the Indian Act, those decisions are made by those who control the purse strings, and we recognize that there are more First Nations now who have the advantage of block funding and have a little bit more control to determine their own priorities, but a great many are still dealing with single program and policy funding authorities, and that creates real issues around capacity. Under self-government, First Nations make those decisions about investment and also have the legislative and policy capacity, as well as the ability to regulate and enforce their own laws, which is rare on many First Nations still operating under the Indian Act. In regards to finance and economy, there are growing options, again, for Indian Act administration to raise their own revenue and become more financially independent. But the options do increase under self-government, with more options for truly independent decision-making over revenue generation and priority spending as a government, as I mentioned. And most particularly when the nation enjoys clarity over its authority for land and resource development options. Last but not least is the dramatic difference in relationships with other governments between Indian Act First Nations and those who begin the shift to self-determination. In general, under the Indian Act, First Nations are dependent on other governments for almost all aspects of running their community life. And even when other governments are good and they're supportive partners, that can really change overnight with an election. So there's a real instability, and I'm meaning the election of other governments, there's a real instability in that way of life. But under self-government, First Nations have the legal, financial, and governing foundations that allow them to interact on an equal footing and to be able to withstand periods or episodes of tension in the relationship with other governments. So I'll leave it at that. As I said, there'll be lots of time for debate and dissension and further discussion. But as I said, I hope it sort of brings us at least roughly together in kind of the same place around what we hope to do and what we want to talk about. Thank you.
You'll be glad to know I don't have a lot to say. I don't even have any slides. I think I don't usually do this, but I feel like I should introduce myself too. I am literally a child of settlers. On both sides of my family were refugees. My mother's people were Doukhobors, who came to Canada in the late 19th century. I grew up in southern Alberta, where my mom ended up. My father was a refugee from fascism in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I guess I grew up extremely grateful that I've had the privilege of being born and living in this territory, and I'm doubly grateful that I have a chance to live here in this territory. I've learned a lot. My own early education started when I was growing up from kids I knew at school. In these issues, but also my early academic years were spent in the Mackenzie Valley, and I there learned a lot from Dene and Métis people starting in the 1970s. So it's been a very great privilege to grow up in that sort of a setting and then to develop my own work as an academic, always in that context. My job in this moment in the program, and you're 5 minutes away from the coffee break, is to talk a little bit about the research that we planned for, or the approach to the research that we planned, and the invitation that we're extending in this meeting. As my colleagues have said, we initiated this project in order to organize resources to conduct research that will be relevant to your concerns. We're looking for your advice about next steps. We're interested in research that is applied and directly useful in your work, that's open-ended and searching, that addresses the most significant issues, that's useful to other First Nations, that is of the very highest quality, and that will generate results that we are able to explain clearly and to just make widely available. That's our offer to you. That's what we're hoping to do with this project. You know, this area is full of complex technical questions and legal language, and we're open to addressing any and all of those that are important. It's also an area of extreme complexity with respect to administration, how things have been done, how things could be done. We recognize that there a lot of detailed work is necessary that may not be lifted and placed in and used in other places, but that is particular to particular situations. But there will also be broad questions about best community development practices, about what we can learn from experience across the country, about the engagement of youth and elders, and many, many other things. So we're hoping that today's discussion might touch on some of those things, that it'll be broad and open-ended. And, the fact is we invited all of you very consciously and carefully because we knew that you all had important things to say. And we're here, above all, to listen to those and to participate in the conversation about those. We also wanted to create an opportunity for you all to meet each other, to meet people that you didn't know, compare notes with. And we hope we've left enough room in the 3 days for that to happen. We did put the discipline on our own work to develop a sort of it's a working roadmap of the steps that we would like to go through. We want to start with a small group. We wanted to start with a small group of First Nation participants who we thought would be like-minded, who would be interested in these questions. We've accomplished that. So far, so good. You're here. Secondly, we wanted to slowly work with you towards transitional governance from wherever you are, wherever you'd like to start, and wherever you're ready to start, and the next step, where you'd like to go next. We want to learn, adapt, and grow collective knowledge, shared knowledge, so that others can start transitioning away from the Indian Act, learning from the experiences make sense to them. We plan to continually conduct this applied research and support work in the communities. We want to help you consolidate outcomes, learn lessons, and share them. And finally, we'd like to develop transitional governance models that any First Nation government can use to move away from the Indian Act and into inherent right self-government. That's our starting idea. None of that will happen without your participation. And so these 3 days are very important to us. As Satsan said, we've been dreaming of this for a long time. We've been dreaming of these 3 days for a long time. Wherever the discussion goes over the next few days, we will reproduce a report on what we learned here, and we'll make it available to you as quickly as we can, and we'll also make it public so that other First Nation people who couldn't come to this, or other academics who might be interested in joining us, can learn from the discussion that we're having here. I would like to conclude by just offering what is the overarching question for today, and invite you to think about what you might want to share about that as the time goes on. The questions are, how do we get self-government done? How can we make it happen? What kind of support do you need to advance your progress towards self-government? Those are our starting questions, and of course we're interested in any and all reactions to that. We've arrived at the time for a coffee break and a stretch break, so perhaps we'll do that, and I'll ask you to come back at 10:45.